The night Ada died, the rain fell so hard it washed the blood off the kitchen floor before anyone could see it. That was the part that always stayed with people who lived on Okafor Street in Lagos. Not the ambulance that came too late. Not the husband who stood outside in the rain looking calm, almost bored, while his wife was being carried out on a stretcher. It was the rain. The way it came down exactly when it needed to. As if the sky itself was cleaning up a crime. Ada Chukwu was 31 years old when she died. She had long arms and a small face and eyes that people always said were too big for her head, like she was always seeing more than she was supposed to see. She sold fabric from a little shop on the corner of Okafor Street and Bright Avenue, and she was good at it. Not just good, exceptional. She could look at a woman and tell immediately what color would make her skin glow, what pattern would make her waist look smaller, what fabric would make her feel like the most important person in the room. People came from Surulere, from Yaba, from as far as Lekki just to buy from Ada. She had built that shop from nothing. That was the first thing her husband stole from her. His name was Raymond. Raymond Chukwu. He was tall and handsome in a way that made people trust him automatically, the kind of man whose smile arrived before the rest of his face did. When he walked into a room, people straightened up. When he spoke, people listened. He had that kind of presence, the kind that felt like authority even when it had no foundation underneath it. He had met Ada 7 years before her death, at a cousin's wedding in Aja. She had been wearing yellow that day, a deep, warm yellow that made her look like sunlight had chosen her specifically. Raymond had watched her from across the room for 40 minutes before he finally walked over. He told her later that he had been afraid, that he had never been afraid of a woman before her. Ada had laughed when he said that. She had thought it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. She was wrong. It was not fear. It was calculation. Raymond had watched her for 40 minutes because he was studying her. He had already heard about the fabric shop from a mutual friend. He had already known that Ada's shop was pulling in more money than most men on Okafor Street would ever see. He had done the math before he ever spoke her name. But Ada did not know any of that on the day of the wedding. She only knew that he was handsome, that he made her laugh, and that when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she had never felt before. She was 24 years old. She had worked hard her whole life and had never let herself be soft for anyone. Raymond felt like a reward, like the universe finally saying, "You have earned something good." They were married within 8 months. The first year was beautiful. Raymond helped in the shop sometimes, mostly just sitting at the counter making people feel good, charming customers into buying more than they planned. Ada thought they were partners. She thought they were building something together. She would come home tired and Raymond would have food on the table sometimes, and she would think, "This is it. This is what I wanted." Then the first loan happened. Raymond came to her one evening with a business idea. A transport business. 3 buses, Lagos to Ibadan, back and forth every day. He had done the numbers, he said. He had the contacts. He just needed startup money. Ada's shop had a business account. Ada had savings. Ada had also just gotten approved for a small business loan from a microfinance bank. "It is our money," Raymond said very gently, the way a man says something he has already decided. "I am your husband. We are one body." Ada gave him the money. The transport business never existed. She found out 4 months later when she called the supposed partner Raymond had mentioned, a man named Festus. And Festus told her plainly that he had not seen Raymond in over a year, and that they had no deal together, no buses, no routes, nothing. When she confronted Raymond that night, something shifted in his face, something she had not seen before. It was not guilt. It was not shame. It was a kind of cold assessment, like he was looking at her and recalculating, deciding how much force was necessary. "You are calling my friends to investigate me?" he said. "I am asking where my money went. she said. That was the first time he hit her. She told nobody. Not her mother, not her sister Grace, who lived in Abuja, not her friend Cynthia, who came to the shop every Wednesday to buy lace. She told nobody because she was ashamed, and because she thought it would not happen again, and because somewhere inside her, the part of her that had believed Raymond was a reward for her hard life was not ready to accept that the reward had been a trap. It happened again, and again. And the money kept disappearing. Raymond would find reasons. Her signature was needed here, an emergency was happening there, business was slow, and the family needed to survive. He stopped pretending the money was going anywhere purposeful. He just took it. And if she said anything, if she made any sound of protest, she paid for it with her body. The shop started struggling. Ada could not restock the way she used to. Customers who came expecting her full inventory started going elsewhere. The woman who had built something from nothing was watching it dissolve, and she could not explain to anyone why, because explaining would mean admitting, and admitting would mean she had to do something about it, and she was too broken and too afraid to figure out what that something was. By the time Ada was 30 years old, the shop was running on fumes. She had 2 children, a boy named Tabena, who was 4, and a girl named Chizara, who was 2. And Raymond had a girlfriend. Not a hidden one. A flagrant one. A woman named Sandra who lived in Festac, and who called Raymond's phone so regularly that Ada had memorized the ringtone pattern. Still, Ada stayed. She stayed because of Tabena and Chizara. She stayed because she had nowhere to go. Her parents were gone, and she and her sister Grace had grown distant over the years. Raymond had made sure of that, slowly poisoning the relationship the way he poisoned everything. She stayed because she had spent so many years being reduced that she had started to believe maybe this was all she deserved. That the girl who wore yellow at a wedding and made a man afraid to approach her had been a temporary version of herself. That this, the bruises, the silence, the empty shop account, was the real version. She was wrong about that too. But she found out too late. The night she died, Raymond had come home in a strange mood. Not angry, almost too cheerful. He had brought takeaway food, had played with the children, had smiled at Ada in a way that should have felt like a gift, but instead felt like a warning. Ada had watched him from the corner of her eye all evening, trying to read him, trying to stay ahead of whatever was coming. After the children were asleep, he came into the kitchen where she was cleaning up. He told her he was selling the shop, not asking, telling. The shop was in his name. That had happened in year 2 of their marriage. A legal requirement, he had said, for some business registration. Ada had signed the papers without reading them fully because she had been busy and she had trusted him. She had trusted him. When he said he was selling the shop, something happened inside Ada that she herself did not expect. All the years of silence, they cracked. Just like that. She told him no. She told him that shop was her life. She told him she had built it before he ever existed in her world, and she would die before she let him sell it. He said fine, and then he made sure she died. The official cause of death was a fall. She slipped in the kitchen. Her head hit the corner of the counter. She bled internally. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Raymond stood in the rain outside looking calm, almost bored. And the rain washed the floor clean, and no one asked the right questions. He buried her in a cemetery on the outskirts of Lagos, on a Thursday, with a small ceremony. Her sister Grace did not even know until 3 days later. By then, the body was already in the ground. 2 weeks after the burial, Raymond began dating Sandra openly. 6 weeks after the burial, he filed papers to finalize the sale of the shop. 8 weeks after the burial, something came back. And it was wearing Ada's face. It started small. The way all terrifying things start. small enough that you can convince yourself it is nothing. The first sign was Tobena. Tobena was 4 years old and had barely spoken since his mother died. He just sat in corners and looked at walls. Raymond had told the children their mother had an accident. Tobena had absorbed this information and become very still, the way children become still when they are carrying something too heavy for their small bodies. Then one morning, 8 weeks after the burial, Tobena walked into the kitchen where Raymond was drinking tea and said, very quietly, "Mummy says you should give back what you took." Raymond froze. "What?" he said. "Mummy says you should give back what you took," Tobena said again. "She says she is waiting." Raymond stared at his son for a long time. Then he told himself children say strange things when they are grieving. He told himself it meant nothing. That night, he dreamed of Ada in her yellow dress, standing at the foot of his bed. She was not angry in the dream. She was just watching him with those eyes that were too big for her face. And in the dream he knew, the way you know things in dreams without being told, that she had been watching him for 8 weeks. Every single night. She had been standing there at the foot of his bed, and he had just been too deep in his own sleep to see her. He woke up sweating and convinced himself it was nothing. The second sign was the shop. The buyer had agreed to a price. Documents were being prepared. The lawyer had confirmed the transfer date. And then, 3 days before the sale was meant to complete, a woman appeared at the shop. She was old. Ancient, actually. The kind of old that looks like it was decided at the beginning of time. And she was wearing a green wrapper and her face was full of lines, and she sat in front of the shop on the ground. Not on a chair, on the ground. And she said she was not moving until the sale was cancelled. Raymond sent 2 men to remove her. They tried. Both men reported the same thing afterward, separately to different people. That when they reached for her, their hands went numb. That she looked at them with eyes that were too big for her face and said, "Tell Raymond that Ada sends her greetings." Both men quit that same day. The buyer started getting nervous. He called Raymond and said he was hearing strange things about the property. Raymond shouted at him. The buyer said he was reconsidering. Raymond was furious but not yet afraid. He was the kind of man who categorized fear as something that happened to other people. The third sign was Sandra. Sandra came to the house for the first time on a Friday night. Bold now, no longer any reason to hide. She had brought a bag. She had been planning to stay the weekend. She walked into the house. She walked into the bedroom. She opened the wardrobe to hang up her clothes. And she saw Ada's dresses. Raymond had not removed them. Not for any sentimental reason. He simply had not bothered, had not seen the point. They were just hanging there. Ada's colors, Ada's fabrics, chosen with the same eye she used to dress other women. Sandra stared at the dresses. Then one of them, a yellow one, deep, warm yellow, fell off its hanger. By itself. Sandra did not scream. She was not the type to scream. But she stepped back very fast, and she looked at Raymond, and something in her eyes had changed. "I am not staying this weekend," she said. "It is just a dress," Raymond said. "It fell by itself," she said. "Wind," he said. "There is no wind, Raymond. The windows are closed." She left. She did not come back for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, things in the house started happening. Quiet things, the kind of things that do not have explanations that satisfy even a skeptical mind. Food that Raymond cooked tasted wrong. Not bad wrong, just wrong, like something was missing from it. Like the warmth had been removed. He would make a pot of soup, and it would taste like he had forgotten the most important ingredient, except he could not identify what the missing ingredient was. He cooked again. Same result. His phone started dropping calls. Not all calls. Only calls with Sandra. He would dial her number and the line would go quiet, or a strange sound would replace her voice. something that he would later describe to the one person he eventually told about it as sounding almost like fabric, like the rustling of fabric. His sleep, which had been fine since the dream, stopped being fine. He started waking up at the same time every night, 3:47 a.m., always exactly 3:47, with the absolute certainty that there was someone in the room. He would lie there in the dark and he would not be able to move, not from sleep paralysis but from something else, something that felt like being held in place, like invisible hands pressing him flat into the mattress, and he would feel, not see, feel, a presence at the foot of his bed. He bought a small generator for the room and started sleeping with the lights on. It did not help, because the thing at the foot of his bed did not need darkness. She had never needed darkness. She had spent 7 years learning to exist in the harshest conditions Raymond could create. A light bulb was nothing to her. Then the letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in handwriting that Raymond recognized immediately, handwriting he had seen on shop receipts and grocery lists and children's school permission slips, were 7 words. "I know where everything is hidden, Raymond." He sat at the kitchen table holding that letter for a long time. His hands, for the first time in his life, were shaking, because there was something hidden, something that nobody knew about. Not Sandra, not his lawyer, not the accountant who managed the shop sale documents. In the 3rd year of his marriage, Raymond had opened a private account. Everything he had siphoned from Ada's business over the years, every loan repayment he had intercepted, every deal he had made using her shop's reputation and then pocketed the proceeds. It had all been going into that account. The amount in it, by the time Ada died, was something that would make a reasonable person understand exactly how deliberate and thorough Raymond's plan had been. He had told nobody. Ada had never found the account. Or so he had believed. He turned the letter over. On the back, also in Ada's handwriting, was an address. A Lagos address. Specific street, specific building, specific unit number. And he did not recognize it, but he knew, with a cold certainty that settled in his stomach like a stone, that if he went to that address, something would be waiting for him. The question was whether he was brave enough, or afraid enough, to go. He went. He told himself he was going to prove that this was nonsense, that someone, some enemy, some person who wanted to interfere with the shop sale, was playing games with him. He told himself Ada was dead. He had made sure of it. He told himself all of this in the car on the way there, and he did not believe a single word of it by the time he parked. The address led him to a quiet building in Surulere. Not old, not decrepit. Not the kind of place that appears in stories about hauntings. Just a regular cream-colored building on a regular street, each with a small garden in front and curtains in the windows. He rang the bell for the unit number on the letter. A woman opened the door. She was wearing blue. She had long arms and a small face. And when she looked at him, her eyes, too big for her face, went straight through him like a needle through thin cloth. She was not a ghost. She was Grace, Ada's sister. She looked at him for a moment, and then she stepped aside and let him in, and Raymond Chukwu walked into the home of the one person who had been putting everything together for 8 weeks, and the door closed behind him, and his life, as he had constructed it, began to end. "Sit down, Raymond," Grace said. He sat. She did not offer him water. She did not smile. She had Ada's stillness. That quality Ada had of making you feel like she was seeing more than you wanted her to see. "I have been here for 6 weeks," Grace said, "since the week after I found out my sister was dead." She said the word dead clearly, without looking away from him. "I have spoken to the doctor who signed the death certificate. I have spoken to the neighbors on Okafor Street. I have spoken to the lawyer handling the shop sale. I have spoken to the microfinance bank. She paused. And I have found the account, Raymond. The private account. All of it. Raymond opened his mouth. Do not speak yet, Grace said. Her voice was quiet. The quietest he had ever heard a voice and still feel like a wall. I have not finished. She placed a folder on the table between them. Thick. Full of papers. I have given copies of everything in this folder to 3 people, she said. A journalist, a lawyer who is not yours, and a police officer who knew my sister personally and who has been waiting for a reason to ask questions. She looked at him steadily. The only reason none of them have moved yet is because I wanted to speak to you first. Because Ada would have wanted that. She believed in giving people a chance to do the right thing, even when they did not deserve it. Raymond stared at the folder. What do you want? He said. The shop, Grace said simply. Signed back correctly. Not to me, to Tobena and Chisara, held in trust until they are adults. The private account, all of it, transferred into a fund for the children's education. And you will never come near those children again except when they choose to come near you. They will grow up knowing exactly who their mother was and exactly who you are. Not my version. Not your version. The truth. You cannot prove. I have already proved it, Grace said. Everything in that folder is evidence. I spent 6 weeks making it so that even the best lawyer you can afford cannot undo it. Raymond sat very still. And if I refuse? He said. Grace tilted her head slightly. Then by tomorrow morning, the journalist has the story. By tomorrow afternoon, the police have the folder. By next week, you will be answering questions in a room that you cannot charm your way out of, about a woman who died in a kitchen on a rainy night, and about an account that should not exist. She stood up. Ada worked her whole life for what she built, Grace said. She loved you because she thought you were safe. You turned that love into a transaction. You took everything from her while she was alive, and then you took the last thing. You took her life and called it an accident. Her voice did not break. It was not the voice of a woman who is still in the part of grief where things are raw. It was the voice of a woman who had moved through that fire and come out the other side carrying something harder than sadness. You do not get to keep what you stole?
Raymond Chukwu looked at Grace for a long time. He thought about the letter, the handwriting, the account nobody should have known about. How did you find the account? He said. Grace looked at him. Ada told me, she said. He blinked. Ada has been dead for 8 weeks. Yes, Grace said. She did not explain further. The truth, the real truth, the one that would never make it into any legal document or police report, was this. Grace had arrived in Lagos 6 weeks ago with nothing but grief and determination. She had gone to the house on Okafor Street. She had let herself in with the spare key Ada had given her years ago, and that Raymond had forgotten existed. She had sat in Ada's kitchen, and she had wept for a long time. And then she had started looking. She had found Ada's notebooks. Ada had always kept notebooks, not diaries, but careful records, receipts, figures, dates, account numbers. Ada had been meticulous about money because she had learned from the very beginning that money was the thing Raymond targeted first. And in the last notebook, tucked under a loose floorboard in the kitchen, that Grace only found because she had spent a childhood knowing all of Ada's hiding places, in that notebook, written in Ada's careful handwriting, was everything. The private account number, the transactions, dates and amounts cross-referenced with events Raymond had manufactured. It was a complete record, kept by a woman who had known, somewhere beneath the surface, that she needed to protect herself even if she could not yet figure out how. Ada had been building evidence for 2 years. She had not known what she was going to do with it. She had not been there yet, the place of action. She had been gathering courage in small amounts, hiding it alongside the numbers. She had died before she could use it. But Grace had found it. And Grace had used it for her. The letter had been Grace's idea, written in her best imitation of Ada's handwriting, which she had practiced for 3 days until it was right. She was not proud of the deception, but she was not ashamed of it either. Tabena's words in the kitchen had not been coached. Grace had not told the child to say anything. That part she could not explain, and she had stopped trying. The dress falling had been Grace, who had entered the house using the spare key, while Raymond and Sandra were downstairs, who had loosened the hanger just enough, who had left before they came upstairs. But the food tasting wrong, the dropped calls, the presence at 3:47 a.m., those Grace could not account for, and she chose not to try. The shop sale was canceled the following week. The document transferring the property to a trust in the children's names was signed 17 days after Raymond sat in Grace's apartment in Surulere. His lawyer had looked at everything in the folder and told him, very quietly, that he should sign. Raymond had signed. The private account was harder. He fought it for 3 weeks. And then the journalist published a piece. Not the full story, just enough. A piece about a Lagos woman who died under suspicious circumstances and about questions that deserved to be asked. It named no names, but anyone who knew Okafor Street knew exactly who it was about. The police officer called Raymond in for a conversation. After that conversation, now the money moved. Raymond left Lagos 4 months after Ada's death. Nobody knows exactly where he went. Sandra stopped answering his calls before the journalist's piece even published. He was not charged. The evidence for the kitchen was not quite enough, not in a system that asks for more certainty than was available. But he was finished in every other way. His reputation, his network, his easy charm, all of it turned to smoke. People who had smiled at him on Okafor Street now crossed to the other side. People who had trusted his presence now saw it clearly for what it had always been. Tobena and Chisara went to live with Grace. The shop reopened 11 months after it had closed. Grace ran it with 2 of Ada's old staff. She was not Ada. Nobody who had ever met Ada would say she was. She did not have the same eye, the same instinct, the same gift for making a woman feel like the most important person in the room. But she had Ada's records, Ada's supplier contacts, Ada's loyal customers who came back simply because they had heard that the shop was Ada's legacy now, that her children would one day inherit it. On the first anniversary of Ada's death, Grace took Tobena and Chisara to the cemetery. Tobena was 5 now. He was still quiet, still the kind of child who sat in corners and looked at things with attention. But he had started talking more. He had started drawing little pictures of a woman in a yellow dress. At the grave, he placed one of his drawings on the headstone. Grace watched him and did not say anything. Then Tobena looked up at her and said, "She says thank you." Grace did not ask how he knew. She knelt down and pressed her palm to the ground, and she said very quietly, into the earth and the grass and whatever was beneath, "You built something real, Ada. He could not take that. Nobody can take what you built." The wind moved through the cemetery then, just briefly, just enough to lift the edge of Tobena's drawing and set it back down gently, like something had looked at it and approved. And that was that. Except for one thing. The day Grace had cleaned out Ada's wardrobe, weeks before Sandra ever came to the house, before the yellow dress fell, before any of it, Grace had taken one item and kept it. The yellow dress. Ada had been wearing it in a photograph from a cousin's wedding in Aja, 7 years before everything. She was 24 in the photograph, and she was laughing at something. And the yellow was so deep and warm, it looked like sunlight had chosen her specifically. Grace kept the dress folded in a box in her apartment. She did not know yet what she would do with it. Maybe one day, when Chisara was old enough, when she was the age Ada had been in that photograph, young and full of the possibility of being chosen, maybe Grace would give it to her. Maybe she would tell her everything. Maybe she would say, "Your mother built something. Your mother was not a victim, even in the years that made her look like one. She was a woman who was gathering herself, who kept records in notebooks under floorboards, who wore yellow like she knew exactly what she deserved. And maybe, most importantly, she would say, "The rain washed the floor clean, but it did not wash the truth away." Because the truth does not need the rain to protect it. The truth waits, quiet and patient, like a woman with eyes too big for her face, standing at the foot of a bed at 3:47 a.m., waiting for the right time to collect what was stolen. This is what greed does to a family. This is what silence costs a woman who should have been safe in her own home. This is what love looks like when it is weaponized, and what justice looks like when it finally finds its way through the back door, through an old notebook under a kitchen floorboard, through a sister who refused to let the rain have the last word. If you have ever loved someone who was quietly taking from you, you know Ada's story. If you have ever stayed silent when you should have spoken, you know Ada's story. And if you have ever been the Grace, the one who arrived too late to save someone but refused to arrive too late for what came after, then you know that some fights are not about the person who is gone. They are about the children who are left. They are about the dress in the box. They are about making sure that what was built does not disappear into the ground with the person who built it. Ada built something real. And it is still standing.